we start first. So Robert will be kind enough to keep time, but kindly keep a timer by your side as well for more accurate timekeeping. Second, kindly reiterate your POI preference before you start speaking, and let's respect one another's POI preference. Number three, this is a tournament with a mandatory POI rule, so kindly accept and raise POIs because that will elevate the engagement and thereby your scores in the round. But at the same time, I'll stop you in your speech if it's already nearing six and you still haven't accepted a POI and one has been raised throughout the whole round. And lastly, debate is a fun, safe, and conducive learning environment. Let's keep it that way. So kindly don't say anything that may be offensive or hurtful towards anyone in this room. So, sorry, Vince, can you clarify what you chatted? Yeah, OC clarify that minimum is two and not one. So minimum of two POIs per speech. So just to get everything straightened out. Do we all have the same understanding? So each speaker should get or should accept at least two POIs if two POIs are raised throughout the course of their speech. Is everybody in the same understanding? Are we on the same page? Okay, so there's no objections. Okay. With that said, that since you're debating the second motion, right? So the emotions one, am I correct? Okay. So with that said, debating on the motion, this house believes that in their educational curricula, primary schools should heavily prioritize lessons that aim to validate and legitimize emotions that are dominantly perceived to be negative, calling on Prime Minister to open the case for the government. Here.
Hello, just asking for feedback if I'm audible.
Yeah, I mean, or like let's say background, like a background noise. That's yeah, kind of weird.
Yes, back. Oh, really? Um, can I use someone else's device? Another background noise. Yeah. Okay, hang
Can
on.
make it out of a bit breathing, the noise. So yeah, if we could do something about that. Thank you very much.
Hello, how about this?
Yes, good. Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, perfect as well. Anyways, yeah, angelic, any pronouns, POIs, two voice. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. In status quo, there's a noticeable clamor towards like casual therapy, right? Like when 9 to 5 workers, for example, just have, a weekly therapy session. As this generation has grown to realize that their emotional states aren't perfect, that even if they turned out fine, there's also this sad admittance that our habits aren't great, that we're not the best at handling relationships, for example. And I think from government side, we think that stuff like this root back to our childhood days when we were experiencing big emotions and we didn't really know what to do with them, or maybe if you were told to do something about them, it was just like, oh, that's a bad thing, so maybe you should just stop experiencing it, or maybe just sit on it and it'll disappear, or something like that, right? What's the goal of this debate? We think, or in government side, we want better emotional development for children, especially in their formative years, right? If we can prove this, that we can achieve this better on our side, then they were able to win this round. Okay. Given this, we think it's best that we address issues like this as early as possible, when their emotions might be big, but the situations are relatively low stakes. For example, someone stole their favorite toy, as opposed to when they have to deal with it as teenagers, where they're being cheated on, for example, or where they're experiencing like friendship issues that are more complicated than just simple this and that, right? Couple of clarifications first. Validation of big emotions and negative, or quote unquote negative emotions, isn't necessarily encouragement of these emotions. We would like to make that clarification as early as possible. What we're trying to tell you here, or trying to explain, is that these are real, regular, unavoidable human emotions, that since we're gonna have to deal with it one way or another, better be ready for it, especially when the emotions are a bit simpler when you're a child, a bit less complicated, a bit less, barged down by, the complexities of this world. When we say heavily prioritized, by the way, we're not saying that we're gonna completely remove other important aspects of their development, like, I don't know, math or English or something like that. We can even integrate it into their classes or whatever, like the way your teacher handles issues in your class. For example, if you're having disputes in class, that is how we see this prioritization. Like it's included in teacher training, for example. Also note that this is actually talking about primary school. It's not necessarily as rigorous as like high school or college or like masters or whatever. So we have space for emotional regulation training or classes or just an inclusion of it in this aspect of the educational system. This is more about how teachers are dealing with students when they are dealing with experiencing rather big emotions. However, opposition might say that this is probably too complicated for children to understand. A couple of preemptive responses then. One, just severely underestimating a child's capacity to learn and have empathy. But two, even if the child can't completely understand the nuances and complexities of like jealousy or anger or selfishness, it's better anyway that there's validation for that their emotions are valid and normal, and they should experience it to understand it, if not now, then at least in the future. And number two, that these emotions are complex, and the simple concept of, quote, complex emotions are brought as early as possible would mean that a child wouldn't be expected to view their emotions as black and white, as completely good or bad, as something that we should either express or suppress with no middle ground. Still, we do think that children are indeed capable of processing these emotions as long as there's proper guidance. And that's where our arguments come in. Argumentation, right? Why schools are a good place to teach emotional regulation for children. One, if this is integrated into the curricula, it means that teachers are being taught these techniques of handling emotional children and imparting that knowledge onto these children. There's basically a standard that these teachers have to achieve as like part of their certification or their license or their training in general, if they're training to specifically be a primary school teacher. Children at this age are also experiencing most of their social life in school. It's where their friends are. They have playground time, I guess, or stuff like that. They're experiencing social hierarchies, for example, in their cafeteria, etc. It's where the conflicts are. It's where big emotions are likely to start, and if they're unattended, they're gonna simmer. The nuance here is that we acknowledge that there are many spaces for children to process their emotions, and that their school teachers aren't their only possible teachers. We acknowledge that. We have parents, etc. So yes, we think that parents are good teachers too, of course, and should be primary teachers as well in making sure these children do have emotional regulation. But given the state of status quo, where the adults now and actually in the past, we're likely to only have their parents as their sole teacher for emotional regulation, maybe it's best that we extend this guidance more holistically and place it in, for example, school. But we can talk about parents later during the second speech, Ashley, right? Exclusive benefits first. On our side, at the best case, we have children who have their emotions in check for majority of their day, where their interpersonal problems are acknowledged and covered. Where if they have issues with a classmate or with a friend, there is a teacher there to, for example, guide them on maybe how to resolve that issue, or at the very least, process their emotions, or at the very, very least, acknowledge those emotions, right? And while we do acknowledge as well that this won't have a 100% success rate, like with all forms of education, really, at the very least, we have children who understand their emotions, or who have a semblance of understanding that emotions generally are complex and that they're allowed to experience them. However, considering the nature of this addition to the curricula, we still think it's more likely that the children are, at the very least, going to learn something. The same way that children who are learning science still remember that what is the powerhouse of the cell? No, ironically, I forgot about that. Anyway, the meta. Right? Why is this important? Why is it important that we talk about where we should place emotional regulation, right? It's because it is a very important aspect of society right now. People are becoming more and more aware about how their personality, about how their emotional regulation, about how their habits, for example, are giving an impression to other people, rather, about how their friends are shaped by the way they process their emotions, about how their relationships are shaped with them processing their emotions, even their work life, etc. This growing understanding of this phenomena is why we should be acknowledging it in the best ways possible. And our solution to that from government side, what we believe in government side, is for it to be included in the school, a place where most people are going to go, a place where most people are going to be experiencing their very first social dilemmas, their very first issues, their very first conflicts with other people, and that we should be, giving some training to the teachers, for example, so that they are able to acknowledge those big feelings in children. And that is why we're very proud to propose. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that fine speech, Prime Minister. And let's call on Leader of Opposition to introduce the clash coming from the opposition bench. Here.
Hello, POIs through voice. I won't be looking at chat. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's first answer two very important questions that government misses if they want to win this debate, because at best, we get a blurry depiction of how this would happen, and instead got a fairy tale utopia, everything works out for the better. And this goes directly into two pieces of framing. Number one, what is the role of a primary school in society? We think that the role of a primary school is primarily one of foundational education. This is introduction to basic concepts that are necessary for living, like math, science, language, and a general baseline around that assumption, things like geography and not getting lost. But number two, the role of any educational institution is to help shape you into a functional member of society. So necessarily, there are always going to be things that these schools are going to be trading off that they expect the future schools to be teaching you. But number three, we think that this indicates how children are at a particularly vulnerable stage of development and lack a lot of emotional nuance in terms of both how they understand and how they deal with these emotions, which is why, like, you can probably expect secondary schools to be more well equipped in dealing with the kinds of emotional outbursts you would expect of children, because you expect them to have a little bit more nuanced understanding of the matter. Even in primary schools right now, we think there's already efforts to attempt to also weigh in emotional education. This further looks like teachers having specialized training in dealing with children, but this is still fundamentally different from what the motion demands of a teacher. But secondly, things like play and nap times that account for developing bodies. Second piece of framing, what is the typical reaction to dealing with perceived negative emotions? Because government doesn't really talk about this. We think that number one, you redirect the emotion in an attempt to soothe the child. You talk about how the emotions themselves are mentioned, the things like selfishness, anger, resentment. So how are you forced to deal with this in government? And you are forced to deal with this is to wholly accept these emotions, because children don't understand the idea of compromise. They are fundamentally unwilling to do so. Like, the emotions themselves come out of instances where there are probably multiple people involved. So the heavy prioritization of negative emotions in this case will end up prioritizing one child over another, which we think is probably not a good thing. And you end up prioritizing like the perceived negative. This is not the actual negative. Third and final piece of framing before that is that we think that the institution with the greatest role of emotional development in this debate is family. And the familial obligation exists, number one, because that is legally enforced. So the state mandates that your family raises you to the best of their ability. That number two, these are the people you are going to be spending a lot of your time with. That number three, you're reliant on these individuals to shape how you think and feel beyond school. And this is more important than school at times, because before you are at school, you're at home learning still. Before moving on to the case preliminary responses, so lessons that aim to validate and legitimize emotions themselves aren't a substitute for therapy, nor are they actually therapy. Multiple levels of responsiveness. Number one, like, that's not what this debate is about. This is stuff like explicit classes dealing with emotions, and to have teachers more directly intervene in specific ways given an inevitable emotional meltdown by a kid. But number two, I don't think it's reasonable for them to do things like integrate emotions into math. So this sort of mechanism doesn't really work out. I don't know how you can treat like, oh, you have 2 units of anger, you should make that into 1 unit of anger. But the 1 unit of anger is an absolute value. That's just so absolutely ridiculous to teach a child. But number three, like, teachers themselves aren't qualified therapists, and having teachers suddenly get new forms of training is under their burden of proof. They need to show how this is reasonable. They can't just fiat this into existence. Our case is simple. This is a pretty weird way to control how kids grow up. And there's two things I'm going to be proving under this. That number one, primary school is a time we would all prefer to forget about ourselves. But then number two, we would prefer that parents do the emotional validity. So I think that a heavy emphasis, and note that on this sort of emotional dealing, is a significant investment, both monetarily and in terms of time. First, explaining monetarily. To have people competent requires specialized training, and if schools pay people commensurate to their value, then exceptionally qualified trainers are outside the bounds of schools with lower budgets. So the benefit probably still exists, but it's minimized to the top percentage of schools who have wildly different goals and curricula anyway. So the benefit at this point from government is minimized if it existed at all. But number two, this is absolutely necessary and important for government, because they can't fiat that everyone will have access to educational professionals with the requisite skills and training to either plan or enact these lessons, not therapy. Weighing this, if they want to claim any benefit, it is also within the burden of proof to prove why the impact is widespread and likely to occur in the first place. Secondly, and now in terms of time, if it is indeed the heavy emphasis on the educational curricula, then the schools are spending less time with actually teaching kids skills that are incalculably valuable later on. Note that the primary distinction beyond this at this point in time is that government talks about schools in general, like we don't really understand what this has to happen in the primary school. Why not the secondary school? Why not in tertiary education or higher forms of education, where your emotional capacity as a human being is a lot more defined and something you are more likely to understand? So what does this look like on their side? It looks like the failure of American education, where kids are now at the 8th grade level, reading at the 3rd grade level because they decide to prioritize other things in the educational system beyond what primary schools meant to present. But number two, it means having to put in extra burden on things like secondary schools for supplementary classes in order to make sure that your students understand foundational maths, or just lowering requirements entirely as a consequence of not wanting your graduation numbers to look horrible. All of this is now to say that like the practical harms of this sort of educational system on society primarily exist on government if they implement this motion. We think that it is necessary to trade off some skill for math for emotional control, just as a straight up consequence of less time being spent on it as a consequence of the emphasis that the motion requires government to defend. Let's weigh this. Assuming both sides get their benefits, we are winning insofar as it doesn't really matter if you're emotionally competent, if you can't function and contribute to society, which we think is the goal of any educational institution. But number two, we think you fundamentally failed the role of an educational institution if your kids, for example, aren't sure where America is, or aren't sure where to locate France, or aren't sure how fractions work or how decimals work, because they spent less time on these things, because teachers had to spend more ability and dedicate a lot more effort, assuming the effort exists in the first place, to make sure that the kids would become emotionally competent. We would prefer that the parents do the emotional validity. I've already given you reasons as to why your family might have an incentive, for instance, to uh uh to raise you well emotionally. Let's deal with the obvious response that DPM is going to give, wherein they claim that, oh, maybe not all families are good to their kids, or or emotionally intelligent. Okay, true, but this is a symmetric problem that exists in a minority of cases, because on their side, not all schools are going to be good to their kids too. We are fine with this harm existing because this means that affirmative now is to find a new line of response insofar as the harm is symmetric. On their side, parents probably aren't going to be as big as a factor anyway, not this additional response to their material. This is because if the norm is that schools are expected to do the emotional teaching for you, then parents themselves become like lazy. They become less likely to do it at home and will complain to the school when you come home and not understand what they want from you. Now, notice how a parental structure of emotional education on our side would probably work. They probably do this in that, number one, they probably do this in the aftermath of specific events and scenarios where they can better define the limits of the situation. But number two, parents are much more in control of a child and the situations that they are in. Schools are limited in this regard because of how often they have to seek the consent of or inform the parents before taking action. How would this be better? Again, weighing. We think that number one, teachers have to manage a lot of students at ratios that make it hard to respond fast. This is unlike parents who have at most 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 ratios, which means a greater amount of attention to detail. But number two, the teacher's ability to enforce punishments and rules is limited by the administration, such as timeouts or detentions, whereas parents have access to more specialized punishments that are going to be more effective at rationalizing emotions, such as tablet ban, no more promise the word, etc. For all these reasons, oppose.
We thank Leader of Opposition for that fine speech, calling on Deputy Prime Minister to extend the case to the government. Here, here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are, loud and clear.
Thank you. I'm setting up my timer again. If you have POIs, I prefer through voice. Starting my speech. Oh, no. Before that, I'd like to say I have like some trigger warnings. I'm going to be talking about violence, and I'm also going to brush on other things that involve violence. So, yeah. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We've all heard the saying, we all learn a lot of things outside of the classroom. But what we have to understand is that a huge chunk of what we learn is from school. This is why Western parents who promote self-paced learning at home for their children for the entirety of their lives get questioned. Because there are exclusive things that a child can only get from school. This involves primarily the social aspect of a child's life. They have to be exposed to this kind of environment where they are capable of making friends and have issues possibly with the people around them, because this is how their social adeptness gets developed. They have to bond with kids with their age, kids who go through the same things and have the same status regarding their frontal lobes, and teachers are the best agents to facilitate such a thing. Parents will not be around majority of their child's life growing up. Our side is more than justified. Call outs for the opposing side, because they had a very soft clash saying that they will still teach the same thing as our side, but they're only going to do it in secondary education. But I think they completely missed how Angelic said that this is necessary in primary education, because these are the formative years of a child. Once a child goes to high school, they already have a developed sense of beliefs. For example, these can be changed, but the likelihood is already low. Primary school is where they form their values and start relationships with other people. And most importantly, the stakes are lower in primary school because what do kids have in terms of conflict in these in this context, right? That might be like their classmate probably stole their crayons or something, as opposed to high school where like the stakes are already very high, probably involves like jealousy and romance and all of that. I think it's better for them to actually know how to develop their feelings when things are just simple. So it's easier for them to transition once they are faced with conflicts that are much more complex than those that they would face in primary school. They say that, oh, on their side, children will not know other subjects anymore. But I think that this is so, like, Your Honor, this is such a reach, right? Because we already said other subjects will still obviously exist. Duh, it's school. But I think that primary education is also not that serious. Like, we teach preschool children like colors and shapes, and I'm sure there's space and time for emotional guidance there because we can also integrate these lessons in everyday activities. We don't have to like say, oh, children, please fight so I can tell you how to like how to like break it up or something. I think these things are can very much be taught by the teacher once like normal conflicts arise. I think that's where they can butt in. But they said they have this like very reachy case where they say, oh, we're preventing therapy. But I think that we have to notice how you're less likely to even need therapy once you have this kind of guidance in primary school. But also, therapy won't disappear on our side of the house because if the teacher recognizes that a child needs more support than what they can offer, then this is how they can better step in and encourage parents to give their children more support. Teachers aren't therapists, but the fact that this is institutionalized means that they have to have at least like the basics of psychology, right? Because once the state mandates this, they are obviously going to do more to give this policy more foundation. But let's engage. Even if these teachers do not have a doctorate degree in psychology, I think that it's so simple to tell a child, yes, it's okay that you're angry. Can you tell your friend over here why you're angry so you can talk it out? That's how you process your anger. Notice though how validating and legitimizing are just as simple as that. Let's preface my extension by talking about the impact, right? How do we create well-balanced adults? Because in Inside Out 2, Riley's emotions brandished her core as someone who is a good daughter, a supportive friend, a good sport. The moment that at adolescence, she acted very differently because of the problems of growing up, her entire sense of self crumbled. You cannot instill in a child that they are perfectly good. They cannot rely and pride themselves on being entirely good because humans feel very negative emotions and they'll feel more of that once they grow older. If we don't teach them as early as primary school that negative emotions are legitimate and valid, the moment that they perceive that they can be quote unquote bad people, they will not know how to function. I'll take that POI.
Let's read the motion in their educational curricula. So we can assume that this is probably going to be an investment on the part of the school, actually, as we define. We think that teachers asking students to explain how they feel is probably going to exist on our side anyway. Like the motion doesn't, you don't need the motion to do that.
So yeah, I think it's better on our side because it's part of the curricula, which means that they have to do it. Some teachers can actually like be more laid back. For example, I think it's better if we make it part of the education where we can actually teach them as extensively as we could, as opposed to just letting something pass by because it's a next day in school, right? Let's talk about parent-child relationships because every parent and child are different. There are those with already good relationships and those with something subpar. We cater to all of these stakeholders. But let's talk about children and how they also foster in different environments because children or even teenagers can grow up with no social life. People who are just very sheltered in their families. What does this mean? This means that these children have no external checks and balances in terms of their values and tendencies. This means that they can grow up to be incels, for example, or have very questionable decisions in life because they're likely to find a community later on in life on the internet via 4chan, for example, will only empower their problematic ways of handling rejection from women. And they just end up fantasizing beating up women, for example. I think this is what Angelic talked about. And she talked about how when these childlike emotions do not get validated, and as a result, they will not get regulated. A lot of people are already good in a textbook sense, but it doesn't mean that they have good emotional intelligence because a lot of children just lack the guidance of their parents or even grow up to be social outcasts or worse, end up in groups that are just as problematic in mature ages. We have to note that a lot of parents are actually very emotionally immature. They just cannot do this job, for example, right? Opposition can say that it takes away the responsibility from the parents to do this themselves, but it's already on the worst, like our worst case, that the parents of these children truly do not care at all. We say that parents, no matter how good or bad they are, will always feel a semblance of responsibility for their children. They will want to provide something good for their children, regardless of their capability. We say that as parents, they have maternal or paternal instinct to try for their children to actually have good conditions in life. We don't say this that this is taking away their responsibility, because a child's life does not come to pause when they go home from school. Parents teach their children homework, for example, right? Parents are bending towards the curriculum of the school. Parents are extensions of a child's school life, but both parents and education have to go hand in hand in helping a child grow up. Parents don't stop providing for their children, for example, right? Just because, like, they don't stop giving a child allowance per se, just because their kid is a scholar. The responsibility persists. But engaging in our worst case, that it does remove the incentive of parents to do so. I still think that it's a benefit for government because we have to understand there are problem parents as much as there are problem children. At least on our side, we cushion the fall of these children in case they have parents who are entirely hands off on them. At least they have proper guidance and don't turn out following their problem parents in the future, assuming the worst case where their parents are drug addicts, for example, or generally just bad parents who do not know what to do with their child. At least the children have a good example to look up to and do not end up like their parents. This is the impact of institutionalizing these emotional lessons. We guarantee that these teachers do have like this kind of leverage because of like this state mandate, for example. We're sure that this is going to be better for all of these stakeholders. For all those reasons and more, we're very proud to propose. Thanks.
We thank BPM for its fine speech, calling on DLO to extend the clash coming from the off bench. Here. Hello, DLO.
Yep. Sorry, I'm just setting up a timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First thing I need to make very clear in this debate, we're pretty explicitly not teaching the same thing the government wants to, unlike what they try to call us out on. We're necessarily trying to remove any idea of bad emotions being good for the children because they're impressionable and because it's not an effective method of teaching. Because parents are going to be so much better at teaching these nuances, and even later in life they have a better teaching. This is not a soft stance at all. It's telling you that we're going to teach the same things as government, because government wants to validate these kinds of feelings. We're completely removing it from this debate. I'll talk about about three things on my in this speech. First is on growth and development, right? Government tells us their main attack on this debate is that they want to make children more emotionally intelligent. First, we think this is unlikely to be done well. We think there's a blanket policy affecting a school's curriculum, like globally, right, and or at least nationally. So we have to deal with the likely harms that come from schools being bad. Eldridge already told you that this kind of education is likely to be done well only in the top schools because monetarily they are the ones who are able to afford this. And it's also true that in the majority of schools it's going to be done badly and have the opposite effect of what government tries to achieve. Realize that even in the status quo, the incentive of public schools especially are to teach children to be good students before being good people. This is seen in things like the extent of punishment, punishment and scare tactics that they employ and utilize for students to actually have good grades. We don't think the emphasis or the prioritization of like teaching these more nuanced emotions and validating this emotion is going to remove this incentive for schools to become to actually want their children to be good students. We think if this was the case, it's still going to be harmful for our government because that necessarily concedes to them having a worse education. We think secondly, values education is valued minimally in public schools already. Like even when you do go to guidance counselors about your problems, for example, the main thing that they are attempting to solve is your lackluster performance as a result of your problems rather than fixing the problems at the root. When you specifically tell them not to tell your parents about like personal problems, they're going to tell them anyway if it's going to make you more compliant.
Point.
Secondly, then, let's briefly enter from Disneyland, where children have a nuanced understanding of human emotions. First, we think that if this is the concession we have to accept, then this means that parents are also more able to easily teach these values anyway, because apparently children can understand these situations. We think parents are going to be more proximate to the children, and they're going to be there to teach them about the different situations. And if children were so understanding, then they wouldn't need the schools to actually have to do this. So we think, first of all, this is just not the case, right? But also, this gives the school school more of an ability to actually teach more important things to these children and achieve the educational benefits that Eldridge tells you when these parents are better able to do this. Okay, I'll take a POI before I move on.
So your critique on our case is that we're bad because we compromise academics in lieu of teaching emotional intelligence. How are you any better when your case is literally to do the same thing in secondary education, where education becomes a lot more serious?
This is not our case. This is exactly what we're talking about. We're just going to remove this from primary schools. Secondary education is going to be the same thing as it is in status quo, where it is being taught, but people have a better understanding of it. The parents are probably are probably able to teach it from the root. There's things like therapy that's available to adults that's not available to children. We don't think this compromises secondary education at all. But lastly, they talk about solving it from the root, that being primary school and rather than secondary. We think this is necessarily untrue because once you reach high school, you're going to have a better understanding of it anyway, even if the problems you're going to experience are worse. We think it's better for your growth and development as a whole because experiencing these problems is what's going to actually give you the values that you see here, right? Let's weigh the likelihoods here. I posit that you're significantly more likely to be able to teach high school students than children, and even if the harms are worse, we're going to talk about this more later in extension, right? Second thing I'm going to talk about then is, are these emotions easy to validate and legitimize? First, how are emotions taught in status quo? In primary schools, it's taught to be dichotomous because it's more palatable for children. They teach it through stories and fables that highlight one emotion as being good, i.e., this person in the story got rewarded for being calm, therefore it's good to stay calm in situations and forgive others instead of being angry. Empirically, this is proven to be at least a little effective when students get out of primary school with even a shallow foundational education on values and virtues by the time they graduate, right? Note, I'm not claiming that status quo has a perfect educational system because it's simply not possible for children to have this in-depth understanding. Secondly, how would it be taught in government's world? In order to validate negative emotions, they need to consider more nuanced takes on emotions and make lessons more complex. The situations where negative emotions are actually valid and good are rare, and you can't give children this rule of thumb to follow. This means three things, right? First, children are less likely to come out with an understanding of what is good or bad, and ultimately end up just confused because everything can be good in certain situations. This is already necessarily worse than the worst case of our side, that children will have a shallow understanding because at the very least they know that good things are good and bad things are bad. Secondly, children hear what they want to hear. At the worst case of this nuanced approach of teaching, children will completely ignore the good and hear the validation of their anger and selfishness. This is how children grow to become spoiled because of bad parenting. When parents affirm all their whims and cries and give them everything they want, if we see the schools that are like teaching at a very low effort to doing this anyway, there's going to be much worse under their side. This is why children will keep being hateful and keep being bullies when they're not told off specifically by telling them that any form of malice towards others is bad because they see themselves as being justified. Like, I have personal problems at home, so it's justified that I take out my negative emotion on this poor person in school, right? But third, all this is so far is ignoring the logistic problems of teaching like this. Making this change in the curriculum means changing a lot of reference materials in subjects like English, where where they use the stories we mentioned to actually teach things like language and reading through the previously mentioned fables. This means that there's going to be significantly harder for them to teach things in status quo because a lot of the reference materials that are already available and have like 11 editions out are teaching these kinds of values through this. We think that removing that necessarily prioritizing and more nuanced understanding means taking the trade-off of removing these materials. Lastly, what's the worst manifestation of children being validated? This is the part of governance nuance that they skirt the most. The worst manifestation of their harm is that children are being validated and will keep being bad. This means an increased amount of bullying for the cases that students are not receptive to education, which is a lot of the time, right? This exists on both sides, but is magnified on their side. This means more students will feel entitled, will feel more entitled just because of this validation. How does this weigh against our worst harms? So we think the worst harms under our side is that children grow up to have a bad perception of bad emotions. There's a trade-off we're willing to take because this means that people will keep their anger within and be selfless to a fault. The way we address emotions inherently in status quo is to make them regulated. Even then, we have the safety net of parents that Eldridge already explained to you. Not only are they the best arbiters in the first place, but when harms pop up, it's easier for the parents. People who feel insecure about experiencing bad emotions, like feeling mad, are significantly easier to teach otherwise compared to people who think of their negative emotions as so much more important than everyone else. These are the self-centered people that ruin society because they're so resilient to change. Because of all these reasons, side with Gov.
We thank DLO for that fine speech. Let's go on to Government to seal the case for the government. Okay.
Hi. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, thanks. Setting up my timer. Okay, starting my speech in, sorry, three, two, one. Emotions that are dominantly perceived to be negative are emotions that are dominantly being avoided in everyday discourse. We highlight the need for these big and complex emotions to be broken down and analyzed with the emphasis on how this should be done during primary school. Let's look at what opposition told us. It told us how parents are less incentivized to try harder for their children. We don't think this is likely to be true. It was these parents who enrolled their children in this curricula. Naturally, they would want their children to do well in school, and whatever these children will learn at school will reflect in their personal lives. Likely then that these parents would inevitably be involved in their children's homeworks and schoolworks, right? Opposition told us that these lessons are not substitute to therapy. Yes, obviously. The point here is decreasing the need for these children to go to therapy in the very first place by teaching them how to handle their big emotions starting from a young age. Opposition's very first attempt to soften the blow of Prime Minister's speech is by rediscussing the role of primary school. They told us that primary school helps shape you as a functional member of society and lay down the concepts of education. From Prime Minister, we already told you how other subjects still exist, and it's primary school, and you just teach them how to read and recognize colors, right? Their alternative is to teach this in secondary grades. Opposition still wants to teach these children either way, and if their harm, which is compromising basic education, is true, then you're still bound to compromise secondary education. We say that this counter proposal is inherently much worse because in high school subjects those are the subjects that are gearing you for university life, for example, and preparing you for professional life. Not to mention, this was a counter prop that was very substantiated. But more on primary schools, right? Why is it important that we do this at this specific period of their life? We do this during primary schools because we told you these are where the stakes are relatively low and the variables are relatively more tame. Emphasis on the context where this debate operates. We highlight the importance that we teach this in primary school, wherein students only face problems that are considerably smaller and easier compared to problems that they'll face when they grow older. The stakes are lower at this age, and there is better room for learning when children are not just suddenly shoved into the harsh world without knowing how to cope with big emotions. Another case of soft lining from opposition was how they believe that basic education will be compromised. But even if we do compromise the basic education of these children, we're going to do what opposition could not. We will hardline. Even if there's a possibility of these children's basic ed to be compromised, we prefer well-adjusted and emotionally intelligent individuals compared to individuals who can recite like the entire periodic table, for example, or are very much academically inclined. Especially in the context of primary school kids, it's important for these children to not only be book smart, but also be ready to face like the harshness of the real world and actually be ready to socialize. What was opposition's other alternative then? From DLO, verbatim, they told us like parents are going to do a much better job at teaching this. Chair, not everyone is blessed with emotionally intelligent parents. Some people has to be the one to break the cycle. We tell you that this is by no means encouragement, nor is it synonymous to tolerance, right? We won't tell children it's okay to punch your classmate because you were just hurt and angry. No, regulation is very much existent. The fact that this will be integrated into the educational curriculum means that it will follow a certain standard, it will be taught by professionals, and it will be done with proper supervision. It will be a very professional approach to understanding emotions, which makes it have better regulations than any other places where the same can be learned, like households or, according to opposition, family. The fact that these emotions are dominantly perceived as negative likely means that there are emotions that are that people generally swerve away from and avoid. This analysis from Prime Minister highlights the importance of A, these children learning how to handle big emotions, and B, the importance of this type of learning can be best begotten from teachers and professionals. We want children to have like a better emotional bandwidth from the very start so that they can grow as emotionally healthy adults who handles their struggles well. Inside government, you get children who will grow up to be adults who knows when and how to resort to healthy coping mechanisms. You get children who will grow up to be adults who are better at conflict resolution because their early education did not shy away from strong emotions and instead broke it down to palatable pieces in which children are able to internalize at a young age. Another very big deadlock in this debate is
POI.
on the children's capacity to absorb information and understand emotions. Even if they don't understand all of its complexities, letting them know that emotions are complex is already important enough. We don't expect these children to recite philosophical excerpts about psychological impact of a traumatic event, for example. We expect these children to know how to deal with the complex emotions that they're inevitably going to encounter in their day-to-day lives. POI.
You still have a minute and a half to engage on the idea of like heavily prioritize, which we explain how has a detrimental impact specifically in educational curricula, which is another thing I'm just gonna let you fly on.
Yes, we already engaged, right, on the very, very worst case that heavily prioritizing would likely mean going to compromise basic education. We told you how that's like significantly better if you compromise basic education compared to secondary education. But more importantly, we told you how we would rather have children who are who are more emotionally intelligent as opposed to children who are more like academically inclined. All throughout the round, opposition never really sufficiently engaged on their worst case. They say that you shouldn't teach this in primary school because you will compromise their studies. Teach this at a later stage instead. But doesn't that mean that there will still be like compromise then?
Here.
On their very worst case, I feel like we're the only ones engaging. Opposition needs to give us a clear discussion on why the risk of children having a bad emotional bandwidth is an okay trade-off as long as you get good basic education. Sure, the very worst case inside government is that we compromise basic education that are taught in primary school. But in your counter proposal, you're still bound to get that harm in your side of the house for those reasons proposed.
Thank you for that fine speech, government whip. Now let's call on Opwit to conclude the case of the off-bench review.
Let me just prop this up somewhere. This is being recorded. I at least want to look okay. God, this day was so busy. All right. Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. Ooh. Do you have a timer? Can I borrow yours, Arshan? All right. Hello, I'm new with POIs to voice. I'll take you when it is convenient. Where's my speech? I don't go by any specific pronouns. Speeches, no crazy. Doesn't really matter. Just don't refer to me as an object. That's my non-negotiable. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. No, government, you cannot skirt burden responsibility just by saying that, well, at least there is validation. There are two things that become the prerequisite to unlocking the benefits on their side. One, it is the ability for children to absorb the lessons the way you intend them to, which unfortunately, we have not underestimated the way children perceive emotions that directly impact them and their worldview. Newsflash, they will only take things if they benefit them. They will not listening to anything else, especially when you validate and legitimize their negative emotions. Secondly, worst case, that maybe the bare minimum is still a benefit. That maybe because there's validation, it's fine. Unfortunately, it only cultivates spoiled kids who rarely can tell whether or not they have to be accountable for what they do. Ops burden is pretty simple. So for us, we prove to you that there is a disconnect in the method and the outcome. That is, you have to weigh the outcome to weigh the value of this motion. It is not a worthy investment to expect from primary schools who should only be doing what they ought to do in the government in any case. Before I go with issuing, let's do a few quick callouts, right? The first call out goes to PM, where I think that they simplify what the model actually looks like on their side, which is immediately from the get-go already is the mark of their downfall under government. At best, they just say things such as, well, you're just telling children you're all right for being mad, and that's going to be how it looks like. It's pretty simple. Why is this a problem? I think it is the burden of PM to fully give us an idea what this policy would even look like to ensure that the benefits accrue. Even despite this not being a policy motion, it's still important for debate to be fruitful. Because of the lack of framing from PM to go to the extreme lengths to be very in-depth, LO's framing stands on how it actually is, that validation and legitimization lacks the necessary nuance when dealing with emotions. Children, even at their best, we usually take what they want to take from lessons. Validation is on the positive spectrum. It is not telling them, yeah, let's find a way to redirect your emotions. It is telling them that, yes, being mad is actually so valid, that's so understandable. That is how children will take it. The deadlock of how it is going to look like, how it's going to be integrated, exists because of the lack of framing that comes from PM. You cannot even take DPM step of trying to recharacterize, because unfortunately it's already too late. It's already something that should have come at first speaker exchange. What it ultimately means then, the reality of how this policy or how this is going to be fully integrated then, or how it's going to look like, comes from our side because we fulfill their burden. That's unfortunate. This isn't So in ultimately that in case, we have to take more credit coming from opposition. Second call out then is that this isn't whether or not this is going to be taught in primary schools or secondary schools. It's not whether or not, oh, the goal is therapy, where it's going to be better for therapists. It is whether or not the value truly exists for primary schools to take such a high burden when they're just simply supposed to take care of children, just trying to give them the basic necessity of things that are objective, things that you don't have to have very extreme amounts of knowledge, where you don't have a high margin of failure that comes with emotional intelligence, which has a lot of nuance and a lot of context. And even if you try to teach teachers how to be better equipped, because the margin of error is so high in comparison to teaching the objective of what already is happening in status quo, that means then the value really truly doesn't exist. There's a false burden on us, and it is a false burden on the emotion. Those are the callouts that I want to just immediately point out from the get-go. So let's talk about then the actual crux of the debate. Do you actually end up with emotionally intelligent children? And this is where the benefit lies a lot. Government says yes because of two things. One, the execution is going to be flawless because it is simple. And two, children are great at absorbing the lessons when they are going to be integrated into education. We already dealt with these two fronts from the get-go down the bench. Firstly, execution will not turn out well, which comes explicitly from LO. Where we tell you that it's a heavy investment on redirecting your curriculums. You have to very much include a lot of the material to suddenly be carrying too much, a lot of redirecting emotions, of trying to make sure that they actually do validate and they actually do legitimize, with no clear picture of how that even looks like in the first place. And that's not something that all schools can afford. At best, you'll probably only reach at top schools. That means that the benefit that is negated when you only have it on a very small amount of people that are going to experience it. And if emotional intelligence is really that important, for you to have such a heavy investment that not everyone can turn to, and I don't think that benefit even exists. But secondly, that is not simple. Validation and legitimization are high barriers. There's a difference in teaching children to regulate their emotions and validating and legitimizing what they feel, especially during primary school, where emotions are intensely felt. The priority of teachers really come with soothing you and making sure that you stop crying, in comparison to making you understand. Unfortunately, children feel soothed when you tell them that they're not wrong, which is what the most likely scenario is going to look like under their side. You would need constant upkeep, which is physically and emotionally taxing on everyone involved, when their job is really just there to teach you the objectiveness of life, where there's barely any debate. Why is it still nice to have to buy them? I think it comes from opposition to provide you the proper world building necessary to consider all accounts of this position. We tell you that there are more facets to consider in comparison to just it being simple. There is more analysis rigor on us in comparison to Gov's unbuilt model. By wait, you have to listen to us. Ultimately, this means from the first issue, the first step to say the value exists already fails from the get-go, when not only does government fail at providing the execution is going to work out 9 out of 10 times, but the standing work comes from us, meaning that you have to take that most of the scenarios going to look like are probably going to look like how from LO frames it as yet to be in debate. And then, first issue that comes from us. Secondly then, are children really that intelligent for this? This comes from our second speaker then. This deals with the best case at execution as well, right? Situation calls for complex nuances even adults fail to understand. That there are reasons behind these emotions. There is a reason why these emotions are perceived as negative by society. That there are victims on the receiving end of your emotions, that you have to care about them as well. Children will take what they want to take. It's something we've reiterated almost every time they have no engagement to. Your first entry to dealing with this emotion is that, oh, you're fine, angry is okay. It might not be encouragement for you, but it is for them. They will barely take note of everything else in that discussion. If you were to intellectualize this, even because I would assume that's how inclusion to curricula actually looks like, children can barely already deal with the objective. What more in scenarios that need a lot of nuance and context that happens with emotional intelligence? Even if you say that they are going to do, they are the greatest geniuses ever, you overburden children who should be dealing with information that they can take. You overburden them to be emotionally intelligent, similar to adults. You overburden teachers to do more than what they sign up for. That is not a value we appreciate with how we deal with children, how we deal with making better members of society. That is also not a value we want to exist in primary schools or schools in general. All of that stands proud to post. Thanks.
Thank you for that fine speech opposition with. Now let's go on to our reply. Here.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. To quote their whip, I feel like we're the only ones engaging. Here is my laundry list of assorted annoyances listening to their case. Number 1, like the selective hearing at DPM, claiming that our counterfactual is that we teach these things at secondary school misses that this is a response, not a counterfactual, that they themselves do not prove uniqueness. This was literally me spoon-feeding them the opportunity to explain the exclusivity that was lacking at Prime Minister. They really thought that this was an aha, got a moment. But it's literally just a failure on their part to engage properly. I thought that the clarification, both in responses and in a POI at DLO, was enough to dissuade them, but Government Whip has, for some reason, decided to die on this very small hill. Their understanding of our case was less than my score in my final engineering exam, and I didn't go to that exam. A huge chunk, they say then, of what we learn is at school. Yeah, but that's like independent of the motion. You can still learn socially as a child without the emphasis on emotional education the motion demands. And this is the continuing problem of exclusivity that happens in Gov. The benefit is unclear as to how much this actually changes stuff. It's pure assertion. At most, government claims that this changes things, but there's no weighing, or I'm not sure what the things are even. The exclusivity of any other benefit is up in the air considering they've done no analysis as to how this motion would manifest on their side. Our whip explains this quite thoroughly. The first words at their whip are framing that should have been said at first. We think this is something you can't credit anyway, aside from being too late. It's a desperate attempt to reinforce the case. But finally, last call out, like teachers have the ability to like validate emotions on both sides of the debate. The emotion specifically burdens Gov to show how this fits within educational curriculums, which is why my POI was so important and why the attempt for them to properly engage with that was so desperately missing. And we explain how this means specific classes and lesson plans that are targeted towards this specific action as a whole. Now they say, oh no, schools are a good place for emotional regulation and they want kids to be emotionally competent. Well, number one, they can't claim that they misspoke here. This is specifically about primary school, not about schools in general. So this means two things. That number one, absent the prioritization of what the role and function of a primary school is, which is something I explicitly gave an entire level of analysis on at first, then you have to believe us. This is specifically about grades 1 to 6. You aren't just learning shapes and colors as they may claim. You are learning polynomials in the coolness of space. These aren't things that just end up like deciding where you are in society. These are things that are going to shape the very circumstances and decisions you are going to make and the opportunities you are going to have access to in the future. So obviously quite important to the kid, as we've proven. They obviously sidestep the analysis of the parents filling in this role. They try and say that parents are basically emotional failures like Uncle Roger, gone to get milk because they're not around much when you grow up as a kid. Well, number one, that doesn't sound very typical. That sounds like ding, 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 an outlier case. So it doesn't really make much sense for them to argue under that assumption. We think it is much more reasonable to assume that you spend just about an equal amount of time at home and at school learning about some general things emotionally, but different sorts of content. But number two, like we think that if parents themselves are emotional failures, then you end up depending on the school. Then that places a higher burden on school, and they don't explain why that's within the function of a school. And given that they fail to explain that, that doesn't make sense within their case. So the actual proving on their side is ultimately lacking. What is the actual priority within the debate? Government has given no analysis or even said the general statement of this is important because in relation to the debate throughout their whole case, we've consistently identified what is important within the round. That is the role and function of a primary school. Why specifically do we want parents to do these things? What is the role of a primary school in terms of teaching kids and telling kids how to grow up? What is the function? What's the primary reason you have specific forms of education, educational curriculums being set up these matters? The non-benefit of the government side through the mutualism of parents is probably something that does not win of the debate. What is left in the debate that is actually contributed material that makes sense within the context of the round, because we're the only team that apparently bothered to read the motion, is opposition. For all these reasons, oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech of reply, and let's go on to gov reply. Right here.
Hello. Hi. Wait, sorry. Hello? Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Starting my reply speech in 3, 2, 1, go. To my understanding, this debate came down to two questions. Firstly, which side is better at teaching big emotions to people in general? And number two, where is education, like school or general education system, better off? On that first question, right? In government, we tell you that primary school is incredibly important in the formative years of a child. That this is the specific age where their social life is almost completely just the school, and that their conflicts are probably lower stakes. Therefore, handling them is likely to be less complicated, and that teachers are probably going to have it easier at working out the students' interpersonal conflicts. Our exclusive benefits, we'd like to make it extremely clear that they were there from the very first speech. We told you about the nuances of what primary education is and what the problems of people this age are, and the clarification about how these teachers are specifically going to handle it. Any mischaracterization of our case is solely on the fault of opposition, and if they fail to acknowledge it as it is, then that's on them, etc. Right? And on ops case, to be honest, I was trying my best to reconcile what the op case really was when it comes to this, right? On one hand, opposition was like, oh, it's better if emotional regulation is in the secondary level, and on the other hand, they said it's actually just supposed to be the parents, because there is an inherent incentive and teachers are actually underqualified for this role, which, by the way, note the contradiction just from that statement. Sure, let's accept both for the sake of generosity. In secondary school, what exactly is the benefit that they have on their side? How did they characterize people in secondary school, and how are they able to process, say, a class that is like this? No substantiation, again, but let's accept this at their best case. Example, this age of students are best equipped at processing negative emotions. Is their point about sacrificing science or math education not applicable then? Or is it only a bad thing when it is a benefit from our side? But sure, they also told us that this is apparently not a counterfactual, and that actually their case was that it's better that parents are the person who teach you emotional regulation. Sure, but what are their safety nets? We acknowledge that there are people that are abusive parents, for example, that there are parents who are probably more busy at their work, for example, and they cannot be able to attend to their child's needs in that specific case. At least on our side, we have this in the education system, but also specifically, again, the nuance, we have this in the primary education system. I don't know if you are just unable to hear that or whatever, right? But secondly, on where is education better off? They told us this is apparently about the school system, about how we get better schools. For example, on government side, we told you that the education system is, for example, better because if really the role of the education system is to make good individuals, for example, that are well adjusted to the world, then it is in fact better that they're having lessons, or at least it is integrated into their curricula, that there are people who are going to help them navigate their emotions, say a teacher, when they have interpersonal conflict in the classroom, in the playground, in the cafeteria, etc., as opposed to on opposition side, where this is not prevalent in their world, or if it was prevalent, they were unable to tell us exactly how this works. They can't keep telling us that we were unable to explain things clearly when it is the exact same fault that they were unable to explain it clearly on their side as well. They were also trying so hard to clamor, for example, that there is this that we have the same benefits. For example, the benefits are mutually exclusive, but at the same time, the harms are apparently not mutually exclusive. Note the contradiction there. And I'm so sorry. Anyways, that's all for now.
Thank you for that fine reply. Thank you for that wonderful debate, everyone. Congratulations on finishing round one of the ABC. So with that said, you may now cross the house and you may go to the convening, and we'll call you when it's time to give the OA. I'd like to check with